The wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles against exposed skin. Lieutenant Mason Hale pulled his tactical scarf higher over his face, squinting through the whiteout conditions at the abandoned observation post ahead. SEAL Team 9 had been operating in these godforsaken mountains for 3 weeks, tracking weapons shipments through terrain that made Afghanistan look hospitable. Christmas Eve meant nothing up here. The calendar was irrelevant when you were 12,000 feet above sea level, watching your breath freeze in the air before it could dissipate. But somewhere in the back of Mason's mind, he remembered his daughter's face last Christmas morning, her gap-toothed smile as she opened presents by the fireplace. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. Tango 1, this is Overwatch. The voice crackled in Mason's earpiece, distorted by atmospheric interference. We've got movement, multiple vehicles heading your direction. Count shows at least 40 hostiles, heavily armed. They know you're there. Mason's jaw tightened. His team consisted of 6 operators, 6 against 40 in terrain that offered minimal cover. The observation post they'd planned to use as a fallback position was compromised. Intelligence had failed them again. He glanced at his men, spread out in a defensive formation behind chunks of ice-covered rock. Chief Petty Officer Derek Vaughn met his eyes, understanding passing between them without words. They'd worked together long enough that communication had become almost telepathic. "Roger that. Overwatch," Mason replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "Can you get us air support?" "Negative. Weather's too severe. You're on your own for at least 2 hours." 2 hours might as well be 2 years. Mason did the math instantly. Ammunition count, defensive positions, extraction routes. Every scenario ended the same way. They were about to get slaughtered on a frozen mountainside while families back home sang carols and roasted chestnuts. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Riley Park moved up beside him, adjusting the medical pack on his back. "Orders, sir?" Before Mason could answer, Petty Officer Nathan Cross spoke up from his position near the ridgeline. "Sir, there's something else. Local intel mentioned a ghost marksman operating in this sector. Supposed to be some kind of legend, a sniper who appears during impossible situations, then vanishes." Mason had heard the stories during briefings. Every war zone had its myths, its supernatural tales that helped soldiers make sense of chaos. A phantom sniper who saved doomed units? It was the kind of folklore that spread when men were desperate for hope. "Legends don't stop bullets, Cross," Mason said flatly. "Get ready for contact. They'll hit us from 3 sides, probably leave the north face open to funnel us into a kill zone. Standard ambush doctrine." The temperature was dropping as night fell completely. Mason checked his rifle for the 20th time, though he knew it was in perfect working order. The ritual calmed him, gave his hands something to do while his mind raced through contingencies. Petty Officer James Brennan was on the .50 caliber machine gun, the only heavy weapon they'd carried this far into the mountains. It would buy them time, but not enough. The storm intensified, visibility dropping to less than 20 meters. In some ways, that was an advantage. It would make them harder to target, but it also meant they couldn't see what was coming. Mason activated his thermal optic, scanning the white void for heat signatures. Nothing yet. The waiting was always the worst part. "Remember your training," Mason said into the team channel. "Controlled bursts, conserve ammunition, and watch your sectors. We make them pay for every inch." Vaughn chambered around with practiced efficiency. "Christmas bonus, right boss?" The dark humor earned a few grim chuckles. These men had been through hell together. Ramadi Helmand Province, classified operations that would never make the history books. If this was where their story ended, at least they'd go down fighting alongside brothers. But Mason wasn't ready to die. Not here, not on Christmas Eve, not when his daughter was waiting for him to come home and teach her how to ride the bicycle she didn't know was hidden in the garage. He'd made promises, and Mason Hale kept his promises. The first thermal signature appeared at the edge of his scope, then another, then a dozen more. They were surrounding the position exactly as he'd predicted. Professional, coordinated, well-equipped. This wasn't some ragtag militia. These were trained soldiers who knew what they were doing. "Contact imminent," Mason announced. "Hold fire until I give the word." The signatures moved closer, confident in their numerical superiority. Mason could make out individual shapes now through the snow assault rifles, RPGs, at least 2 crew-served weapons. His finger rested on the trigger guard, not yet inside, not yet. Then, the first laser sight cut through the storm, a red pinpoint that danced across the ice near Brennan's position. Then, another. Then, a dozen more, crisscrossing through the air like a web designed to trap them. They were being painted, marked for death. Mason's heart slammed against his ribs. This was it. The moment when everything either worked or fell apart. The moment when training either saved you or failed you. The moment when you discovered what kind of man you really were. He opened his mouth to give the order to fire, to start the last battle of their lives. The world exploded into chaos before Mason could speak. Muzzle flashes erupted from three sides simultaneously, exactly as he'd anticipated. Bullets hammered against their defensive positions, chipping away at rock and ice, sending frozen shrapnel spinning through the air. The distinctive crack of AK pattern rifles mixed with the deeper boom of machine guns, creating a symphony of violence that drowned out even the howling wind. Contact left, contact front. Cross was shouting coordinates, his voice competing with the roar of gunfire. They're everywhere. Mason dropped behind cover, rounds passing through the space where his head had been a second before. He brought his rifle up and acquired targets, squeezing off 3-round bursts at the muzzle flashes closest to their position. A shape went down, but 2 more took its place. The enemy had committed serious resources to this operation. Brennan opened up with the machine gun, the heavy weapon thundering as it poured, suppressing fire toward the largest concentration of hostiles. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness, red streaks that briefly illuminated the storm before vanishing. For a moment, the incoming fire slackened as the enemy took cover. 40 enemies now, Mason roared into his radio, more for the record than anything else. If they didn't make it out, at least the after-action report would be accurate. Request immediate extraction. Any available assets. Tango, 1, negative on extraction. Overwatch responded, the voice tense. Storm's getting worse. Nothing can fly in these conditions. You need to break contact and move to secondary exfil point. Break contact. The phrase sounded so clinical, so simple. In reality, it meant running through a blizzard while 40 armed men shot at you from elevated positions. It meant leaving behind anyone who couldn't keep up. It meant abandoning the mission and hoping you survived long enough to feel ashamed about it later. Moving, Vaughn called out, laying down covering fire as Park and Cross bounded backward toward a cluster of boulders 20 meters to the rear. The tactical movement was textbook perfect fire and maneuver, the most basic building block of infantry combat. But textbook tactics assumed you had somewhere to maneuver to. An RPG shrieked overhead, the rocket-propelled grenade passing close enough that Mason felt the displacement of air. It detonated against the cliff face behind them, showering the team with rock fragments and snow. His ears rang from the blast, muffled sounds replacing the cacophony of battle for several long seconds. Through the thermal optic, Mason watched the enemy closing in, tightening the noose. They were professional, patient, letting their superior numbers do the work. No heroics, no rushing in. Just steady pressure, methodical and lethal. Whoever commanded this force knew exactly what they were doing. Riley's hit. Cross's voice cut through the chaos. Man down. Mason's stomach dropped. Riley Park was their medic, the one person they absolutely couldn't afford to lose. He low-crawled through the snow toward where Cross was dragging Park behind cover, bullets kicking up ice all around them. When he reached them, he saw the dark stain spreading across Park's left thigh, blood steaming in the frigid air. Femoral arteries intact. Park grunted through clenched teeth, already applying a tourniquet to his own leg. Even wounded, the medic's training took over. I can still move, but not fast. Then, we carry you, Mason said simply. There was no other option. SEALs didn't leave teammates behind. Not ever. Not even when it meant everyone died together. Another explosion rocked their position, a grenade this time, close enough that Mason felt shrapnel tug at his gear. His left arm went numb, and when he looked down, he saw blood seeping through his sleeve. The wound was superficial, but it was a reminder that their luck was running out rapidly. Brennan was still hammering away with the machine gun, but Mason could hear the rate of fire decreasing. They were running low on ammunition for the big gun, which meant they were about to lose their only significant advantage. Once the 50 went silent, the enemy would rush their position, and it would be over in seconds. Last stand protocol, Mason said quietly into the team channel. His men knew what that meant. Form a tight perimeter. Conserve ammunition, make them pay for the real estate, fight until you couldn't fight anymore, then keep fighting anyway. It was the code they lived by, the promise they'd made to each other. Vaughn moved to Mason's side, blood running down the side of his face from a scalp wound. Hell of a way to spend Christmas, boss. Could be worse, Mason replied, ejecting an empty magazine and seating a fresh one. He was down to 4 mags left. Maybe 3 minutes of continuous fire if he was disciplined. Could be New Year's Eve. The joke was gallows humor at its finest, and both men knew it. They were going to die on this mountain. The only question was how many of the enemy they'd take with them. Mason thought about his daughter again, about the letter he'd written before this deployment, the one that would be delivered to her if he didn't come back. He'd tried to explain why he did this job, why some things were worth dying for. At the time, the words had seemed important. Now, all he wanted was one more Christmas morning with her. The laser sights converged on their position again, dozens of red dots dancing across the snow and ice. This was it, the final push. Mason raised his rifle, selected his first target, and prepared to go down fighting. Then something impossible happened. The enemy soldier, with the RPG, positioned on a ridge approximately 800 meters away, suddenly jerked backward and collapsed. For a split second, Mason thought the man had simply slipped on the ice. Then he heard it, the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle shot, the sound arriving after the bullet had already found its target. Before Mason could process what had happened, a second hostile dropped, this one from nearly the same distance but at a completely different angle. Then a third. Each shot was precise, economical, finding its mark despite conditions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. Wind gusts were hitting 30 knots. Visibility was less than 50 meters in most directions. The shooters were moving targets, not stationary. This kind of marksmanship wasn't just difficult, it was supposed to be impossible. What the hell? Vaughn breathed, his rifle still trained on the enemy position but his finger off the trigger. Who's shooting? The incoming fire had slackened dramatically as the enemy force reacted to this new threat. Mason could see thermal signatures scattering, seeking cover from an opponent they couldn't locate. The laser sights that had been painting his team seconds ago now swept frantically across the landscape, searching for the phantom marksman. Another shot. Another enemy combatant went down, this one clearly visible through Mason's thermal optic. The man had been behind what looked like solid cover, a boulder that should have provided complete protection. Somehow, the shooter had found an angle that exposed just enough of the target to make the shot possible. The level of tactical awareness required to identify and exploit that opportunity was staggering. Sniper, unknown position, Cross reported, his voice tight with disbelief. Can't get a visual, can't determine range or location. They're not showing up on thermal. That made sense if the shooter was properly camouflaged and managing their heat signature. But the shot placement, the range, the conditions, none of it made sense. Mason had worked with some of the best snipers in the world, men who could thread a needle at 1,000 meters. Not one of them would have taken these shots. The risk of missing, of wasting ammunition on low-probability targets, was too high. Unless you knew you wouldn't miss. The enemy force was in disarray now, caught between the SEAL team in front of them and an invisible threat they couldn't locate. Mason seized the opportunity. Vaughn, Cross, lay down, suppressing fire. We're moving to those rocks at R6, taking Park with us. Brennan, cover our movement, then follow. They executed the maneuver in controlled bounds, firing and moving as they'd done 1,000 times in training. But this time, they had help. Every time an enemy soldier tried to establish a firing position to cut off their retreat, another shot would ring out through the storm, and that soldier would drop. It was like having a guardian angel with a rifle, one who never missed and never revealed their position. Park gritted his teeth as Cross and Vaughn carried him, his wounded leg dangling uselessly. Blood was still seeping through the tourniquet, painting a trail in the snow that would be easy to follow. But Mason couldn't worry about that now. First priority was getting his team to a defensible position where they could regroup and reassess. They reached the cluster of boulders, a natural fortress of ice-covered stone that provided cover from 3 sides. Brennan set up the machine gun facing the direction they'd come from, establishing a proper defensive perimeter. Park immediately began treating his own wound more thoroughly, his face pale but his hands steady. Mason scanned the ridgelines through his scope, trying to locate their mysterious benefactor. Nothing. Whoever this shooter was, they were operating at a level that defied conventional understanding. The closest reference point in Mason's experience was a legend he'd heard during his early years as a SEAL, stories about an operator named Locke who could hit targets under conditions that other snipers wouldn't even attempt. But that was just folklore, wasn't it? "Sir, they're regrouping," Brennan reported. "Looks like they're trying to flank us from the east." Before Mason could respond, 2 more shots echoed through the mountains. 2 more hostiles went down. The enemy advance faltered, then stopped completely. Mason could see the confusion in their movements, the hesitation that came from fighting an opponent you couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't counter. For the first time since the ambush began, Mason allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. 800 meters away, perched in a hide she'd constructed 3 days ago, Aria Kane watched the battlefield through her scope. The Accuracy International rifle felt like an extension of her body, familiar and reliable in a way that human relationships had never been. She'd been tracking the enemy force for 6 hours, watching them set up their ambush, calculating angles and distances and wind values out of professional habit. She hadn't planned to intervene. That part of her life was over. After what happened to her team 3 years ago, she'd walked away from it all, left the military, vanished into these mountains, built a new existence that didn't involve the weight of other people's lives in her hands. She'd sworn she was done with the killing, done with the impossible shots and the impossible choices. Then she'd intercepted the SEAL team's communication, heard the desperation in the commander's voice, and something inside her had cracked open. 40 enemies now, the words had cut through her defenses like a hot knife, dragging her back to a night she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. A night when her team had been surrounded, outgunned, calling for help that never came. She'd survived that night. Her teammates hadn't. The guilt had been eating her alive ever since. Aria chambered another round, her movements automatic, despite the 3-year absence from combat. Muscle memory was a strange thing, apparently. You never forgot how to kill people efficiently. The stock settled into her shoulder with familiar weight. Through the scope, she acquired her next target, a machine gunner who was trying to establish a firing position that would devastate the SEAL team's new defensive position. She calculated the shot in seconds. Range 847 meters. Wind gusting from the northwest at 28 knots, shifting to 32. Temperature -15 Celsius, affecting bullet velocity. Target movement minimal, but the target was behind partial cover. The window was closing. Most snipers would wait for a better opportunity. Aria squeezed the trigger. The rifle punched into her shoulder, the suppressor reducing but not eliminating the sharp report. Through the scope, she watched the target drop. Clean hit, center mass. She was already moving, transitioning to her next hide before anyone could triangulate her position. The frozen landscape was her ally. Snow covered her tracks within minutes, wind dispersed her heat signature, and the storm provided acoustic camouflage. She thought about the SEAL commander's voice again. He'd sounded young, maybe early 30s, probably had a family waiting for him, probably had never expected to die on a frozen mountain on Christmas Eve. None of them did. That was the cruel joke of warfare. Everyone thought they'd be the exception, the one who made it home. Aria had made it home. Sometimes she wished she hadn't. Her new position was a crevasse in the ice, barely wide enough for her body, but offering excellent sightlines. She settled in, snow crunching under her as she established a stable shooting platform. The SEAL team was moving, using suppressing fire and tactical bounds to improve their position. Good. They were well trained, disciplined under pressure. That would help keep them alive long enough for her to even the odds. Another target appeared in her scope, an officer by his equipment and the way other soldiers deferred to him. High-value target. She tracked his movement, waiting for a clear shot. The memories kept bubbling up, uninvited and unwelcome. Her old team commander, bleeding out in her arms, using his last breath to make her promise she'd get the others out. She'd kept that promise. It was the only reason she was still alive. The officer moved into the open for just a second. That was all she needed. The shot was instinctive, taken almost before her conscious mind registered the opportunity. The officer went down, and she watched the enemy force's cohesion deteriorate further. Without leadership, even well-trained soldiers struggled. The battle was turning, shifting from a massacre to something more balanced. But Aria knew it wasn't over. 40 hostiles was too many. Eventually, they'd adapt, find cover she couldn't penetrate, wait her out. She had maybe 30 more rounds in her rig, which meant 30 more shots if she was perfect. No misses, no wasted ammunition. Each bullet had to count. She thought about leaving, disappearing back into the mountains and letting the SEAL team fend for themselves. It would be the smart play. Getting involved meant risking everything she'd built, this fragile existence of solitude and silence that kept the nightmares at bay. But then she remembered her team's faces. Bradley, Chen, Rodriguez, Martinez, all dead because she hadn't been good enough, fast enough, perfect enough. Maybe she could be perfect enough this time. Aria acquired her next target and took the shot. The enemy force was adapting, and Aria could see the new tactical pattern emerging. They'd split into smaller units, moving in coordinated bounds that made them harder to target. Whoever had taken over after she'd eliminated their commander knew what they were doing. This wasn't going to be a simple shooting gallery. She shifted positions again, moving through the storm like a ghost. The key to survival as a sniper wasn't just shooting accurately, it was never being where the enemy expected you to be. She'd learned that lesson in a dozen war zones, learned it so thoroughly that constant movement had become second nature. Stay static, and eventually, someone would find you. Keep moving, and you became a phantom. Through her scope, she watched the SEAL team consolidating their defensive position. The wounded medic was being treated by one of his teammates, crude but effective field medicine that would keep him alive for a few more hours. The question was whether they'd all survive long enough for proper medical evacuation. Aria found a new hide, this one on a different ridgeline, approximately 200 meters from her previous position. The change in angle opened up new shooting lanes, exposing targets that had been protected moments before. She identified 3 hostiles setting up what looked like a mortar position. That couldn't be allowed. If they started dropping indirect fire on the SEAL team's position, the Americans wouldn't stand a chance. First shot, the soldier adjusting the mortar's elevation. He dropped before he knew he was being targeted. Second shot, taken before the first body hit the ground, the ammunition bearer. Third shot, faster still, the commander coordinating the position. All 3 down in less than 5 seconds, creating the illusion that multiple shooters were operating in concert. That was the trick her old commander had taught her. Make them think you're everywhere at once. Fire from one position, move, fire from another. Create the impression of a coordinated team rather than a lone operator. It played on human psychology, made the enemy overestimate the threat they were facing. The SEAL commander was smart. She'd been monitoring their radio traffic, and she could hear him piecing together what was happening. He knew they had an unknown ally, and he was beginning to suspect who it might be. 3 years ago, when she'd still been operational, rumors about her capabilities had circulated through special operations communities. They'd called her Phantom because of her habit of shooting from positions that should have been impossible. Sniper unknown identity. If you can hear this, we need to coordinate. The SEAL commander's voice came through her scanner. Enemy has reinforcements inbound. Estimate 15 to 20 additional hostiles arriving within 10 minutes. Aria's jaw tightened. 20 more hostiles would tip the balance back in the enemy's favor. Even with her intervention, the SEAL team couldn't hold against those odds. They needed to break contact now. Use the temporary advantage to escape before the noose tightened again. But the wounded medic complicated everything. He couldn't move quickly, which meant the entire team would be slowed. The enemy would pursue, run them down in the storm, unless someone stayed behind to buy them time. She knew what needed to be done. The tactical calculus was brutal but clear. One person with the right skills, in the right position, could hold off a pursuing force long enough for the others to reach safety. It would be a one-way mission, but it would save the team. Just like 3 years ago, except this time she'd be the one staying behind. Aria pushed the thought away. She wasn't ready to die, not yet. There had to be another option, a tactical solution that didn't require sacrifice. She scanned the terrain through her scope, looking for something, anything that could shift the odds back in their favor. Then she saw it. A narrow pass, barely wide enough for 2 people walking side by side, carved through the mountain by ancient glaciers. If the SEAL team could reach that pass, the enemy's numerical advantage would be neutralized. They'd have to come through single file, turning the pursuit into a shooting gallery. SEAL team, unknown sniper, she transmitted on their frequency. breaking 3 years of radio silence. Her voice felt rusty, unpracticed at human communication. "There's a pass at your 2 o'clock. Approximately 400 meters. That's your extraction route. I'll cover your movement." There was a pause, then the commander's voice came back, tight with surprise. "Copy that, unknown sniper. Can you identify yourself?" Aria didn't respond. Names were dangerous things, especially her name. Instead, she found her next target, a soldier trying to flank the SEAL position from the north, and dropped him with a single shot. Then she shifted, moved, found another firing position. Keep them off balance, keep them guessing, keep them dying. The SEAL team began their movement, using fire and maneuver to bound toward the pass. 2 operators carried the wounded medic between them, moving awkwardly, but steadily. The others provided covering fire, their discipline evident in every movement. These were professionals, men who trained for exactly this kind of situation. But training only got you so far. Sometimes, you needed a miracle. Aria provided the miracle, one shot at a time. The SEAL team was moving with impressive coordination, but Mason could see the strain beginning to show. Vaughn and Cross were carrying Park, whose face had gone from pale to gray. The medic was losing blood, despite the tourniquet, his movements becoming sluggish. They needed proper medical care, and they needed it soon. But first, they needed to survive the next 10 minutes. "Contact right," Brennan shouted, bringing his rifle to bear on movement at their 3 o'clock. Mason spun, acquired the target through his scope, 2 hostiles trying to establish a blocking position that would cut off their route to the pass. Before he could fire, both targets dropped, taken out by their invisible guardian angel. "Jesus," Vaughn muttered. "Whoever that is, they're not human." Mason was beginning to agree. He'd worked with elite snipers, watched them operate under controlled conditions. This was something else entirely. The shooter wasn't just hitting targets, they were reading the entire battlefield, anticipating threats before they materialized, operating at a cognitive level that seemed almost superhuman. Unless it was Aria Locke. The rumors about her had bordered on mythological stories about impossible shots, about saving entire units single-handedly, about disappearing after missions in ways that made people question whether she'd been there at all. Most operators had dismissed the stories as exaggeration, the usual embellishment that happened when soldiers told tales. But Mason had met someone who'd worked with her once, and that operator's face when he'd spoken about her had been reverent. "She sees things," the operator had said. "It's like she's playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. By the time you realize you're in danger, she's already neutralized the threat." And her shooting? Man, I watched her hit a target at 1,500 meters, in the rain, with wind gusts at 40 knots. She made the shot look routine. If this was Locke, and if she'd been living in these mountains for 3 years, Mason didn't want to think about what could drive someone like that into self-imposed exile. The best operators were often the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. "We're 50 meters from the pass," Cross reported, breathing hard from the exertion of carrying Park. "But we've got movement ahead, they're trying to seal it off." Mason's heart sank. If the enemy closed off that bottleneck, they'd be trapped in the open with nowhere to run. He started calculating alternative routes, but every option looked worse than the last. The terrain was working against them, and the storm was intensifying, reducing visibility to the point where they were basically operating blind. "Hold position," the mysterious sniper's voice came through his radio again. "Give me 30 seconds. Mason signaled his team to halt, taking cover behind whatever they could find. 30 seconds felt like 30 years when you were exposed in a kill zone. He watched through his scope as enemy soldiers moved into position at the pass entrance, setting up interlocking fields of fire that would shred anyone trying to approach. Then the shooting began. The first hostile went down, then the second. The third dropped before he could even register, his teammates falling. Mason counted shots, mesmerized by the precision and speed. The sniper was firing from multiple positions, or at least creating that illusion. Each shot came from a slightly different angle, making it impossible for the enemy to pinpoint a single location. In 23 seconds, 6 hostiles were down and the pass entrance was clear. "Move now," the sniper commanded. They moved. Mason took point, rifle up, scanning for threats. Vaughn and Cross followed with Park, the wounded medic now semi-conscious from blood loss. Brennan brought up the rear, walking backward to maintain security on their six. They entered the pass, the walls of ice and rock closing around them, and Mason felt a small measure of relief. This was defensible terrain, but relief was premature. An explosion rocked the entrance to the pass behind them. Someone had fired an RPG, trying to collapse the walls and trap them inside. Rock and ice rained down, but the structure held, barely. "They're going to try to seal us in," Vaughn said, stating the obvious. "Bury us alive. Then we need to move faster," Mason replied. "How far does this pass run?" "Unknown," Cross said. "Could be 100 meters, could be a kilometer. No way to tell in these conditions." Another explosion, closer this time. The enemy was being systematic, trying to create a cave-in. It was a smart tactic. Why risk soldiers in close quarters combat when you could just drop a mountain on your opponent? "SEAL team, this is your overwatch." The sniper's voice was calm, almost clinical. "I'm going after their rocket teams. Keep moving through the pass. There's an exit approximately 200 meters ahead, opens up into a valley with better cover." "Wait," Mason said quickly. "Who are you? What's your designation?" There was a long pause, filled only with the howl of wind and the distant crack of rifle fire. When the sniper spoke again, her voice was softer, almost reluctant. "Locke, Aria Locke, and I know what you're thinking. I'm supposed to be dead. We'll discuss that later if we survive the next hour. Now move." Mason's breath caught. So the legends were true. Aria Locke was alive, operating in these mountains, and she'd just saved their lives. Questions flooded his mind, but they'd have to wait. Right now, survival took priority over curiosity. They pushed deeper into the pass, their headlamps cutting narrow beams through the darkness. Park was slipping in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. Time was running out for him, and they all knew it. Even if they survived the enemy force, they might still lose their medic to blood loss and hypothermia. The pass began to widen, opening into the valley Locke had mentioned. Mason could see better defensive positions ahead, rock formations that would provide cover and concealment, high ground that would give them a tactical advantage. If they could reach those positions, they might actually make it through this nightmare. Behind them, the explosions stopped. Either the enemy had run out of rockets, or Locke had eliminated the threat. Mason chose to believe the latter. Aria had just eliminated the last RPG team when her scanner picked up new radio traffic. The enemy reinforcements had arrived, 15 fresh soldiers, well-equipped and organized. She watched through her scope as they deployed from 2 military trucks, spreading out with the practiced efficiency of trained professionals. This was going to be more difficult. She was low on ammunition, down to maybe 20 rounds total. Each shot had to count more than ever. The SEAL team was still exposed, moving through terrain that offered minimal cover. If these reinforcements caught them in the open, numbers would overwhelm even the best training. Aria needed to change the tactical equation. Raw marksmanship wouldn't be enough anymore. She needed to think strategically, use the environment itself as a weapon. Her eyes tracked across the landscape, analyzing terrain features with the cold calculation of a chess player studying a board. There, an overhanging shelf of snow and ice, probably weakened by the day's temperature fluctuations. If she could trigger a controlled avalanche, it would cut off the enemy reinforcements, buy the SEAL team the time they needed to reach safety. The shot would be technically complex. She'd need to hit a specific point on the overhang with enough force to fracture the structure without causing a massive slide that would threaten both friendly and enemy forces. She adjusted her position, finding a stable platform, despite the wind trying to knock her off balance. Through the scope, she calculated angles and trajectories. The target was small, maybe the size of a dinner plate. The distance was nearly 1,000 meters. The wind was gusting unpredictably. If she missed, the enemy would immediately know her approximate position, and she'd have to relocate before they brought heavy weapons to bear. Aria slowed her breathing, entering that meditative state where everything except the shot fell away. Her heartbeat was a metronome, steady and predictable. She'd fire between beats. When her body was at its stillest, wind gust, settling. Now, the rifle bucked. Through the scope, she watched the bullet impact exactly where she'd aimed. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then cracks spiderwebbed across the ice shelf, spreading like lightning. The structure groaned, a deep bass note that carried through the storm. Then it fell. Thousands of tons of snow and ice crashed down, creating a wall that separated the reinforcements from the main enemy force. It wasn't a permanent solution they'd find a way around eventually, but it bought precious time. "Nice shooting," the SEAL commander's voice came through her radio. "That was improbable." "Impossible is more accurate," Aria replied. "Don't expect me to do it again. That was lucky." It hadn't been luck. She didn't believe in luck, but she wasn't going to explain the hundreds of hours of study, the physics calculations, the environmental analysis that had made that shot possible. Some things were better left mysterious. Through her scanner, she heard the enemy forces regrouping, adjusting their strategy. They were calling for air support, a helicopter gunship that could arrive within 30 minutes. That was the real threat. Aria was good, but even she couldn't shoot down a helicopter with a bolt-action rifle. Well, probably couldn't. She checked her ammunition count again. 18 rounds. Enough for 18 more problems, assuming she didn't miss. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly unfavorable. The SEAL team had reached the defensive positions in the valley. Good. They were established. They had fields of fire. They had cover. If the enemy wanted to dig them out now, it would cost dearly, but a helicopter would change everything. The Americans would be exposed, visible from the air, vulnerable to weapons they had no way to counter. Unless Aria did something absolutely insane. She'd shot at aircraft before, transport helicopters, drones, even a light observation plane once during a classified operation she wasn't supposed to talk about. But a gunship was different. Armored, fast, equipped with thermal imaging and targeting systems that could locate her position. The odds of successfully engaging it were astronomical. But astronomical wasn't the same as impossible. SEAL team, Aria transmitted. "Enemy has helicopter inbound, ETA 25 minutes. You need to be gone before it arrives." "Negative," the commander replied. "Our medic can't move that fast. We're staying here, making our stand." Aria closed her eyes, feeling the old familiar weight settle onto her shoulders. The weight of other people's lives. The weight of impossible decisions. She'd walked away from this precisely because she didn't want to feel this weight ever again. But here she was. And here they were, and the universe apparently had a cruel sense of humor. "Then I'll deal with the helicopter," she said. "That's suicide," the commander responded immediately. "You can't engage a gunship with a rifle." "I've done stupider things." That was true, actually. The operation in Yemen came to mind, though she tried not to think about that particular nightmare. "Focus on staying alive until I neutralize the air threat." She started moving, headed toward a ridgeline that would give her an elevated position. Shooting down a helicopter required hitting the right spot. The tail rotor was the most vulnerable point, but it was also a tiny target on a moving aircraft. The alternative was the engine intake, but that required a straight-on shot, which meant exposing herself completely. 25 minutes. Time was always the enemy's greatest ally. It gave them opportunities to adapt, to bring more resources to bear, to make mistakes irrelevant through sheer persistence. But time could work both ways. Aria had 25 minutes to prepare, to select the perfect position, to calculate every variable. She could do a lot in 25 minutes. Mason watched through his scope as the enemy forces regrouped on the far side of the avalanche. They were probing for weaknesses, testing the SEAL team's defensive perimeter with occasional rifle fire. Nothing serious yet, just prodding, gathering intelligence. The real assault would come soon. Park was stabilized for now, but he needed a surgical suite and a blood transfusion. Field medicine could only do so much. Every minute that passed lowered his chances of full recovery. Mason had already called for emergency medical evacuation, but with the weather and the tactical situation, it would be hours before anyone could reach them. Hours they might not have. "Sir," Cross said, his voice tight. "Movement on the ridge, 3 o'clock. Mason swung his rifle around, then froze. A figure was approaching through the storm, moving with deliberate slowness, hands visible, weapon slung across back. The international signal for "I'm not a threat, please don't shoot me." But after the battle they just survived, Mason's finger rested on the trigger anyway. The figure came closer, resolving into a woman wearing white camouflage and carrying a rifle that had probably cost more than Mason's truck. She moved like a predator, balanced and aware, eyes constantly scanning despite the non-threatening posture. This was someone who'd spent years in war zones, someone who understood that the moment you stopped being careful was the moment you died. "Hold fire," Mason commanded, though every instinct screamed at him to maintain security. "Let her approach." The woman reached their perimeter, stopped at a respectful distance. When she pulled back her face covering, Mason felt his breath catch. Even through the grime and exhaustion, he recognized her from intelligence photos he'd seen years ago. Aria Kane, the legendary sniper who disappeared after a classified operation went wrong, the ghost who'd saved his team. She looked older than her photos, but then everyone looked older after spending time in combat zones. Her eyes were what struck him most, gray-blue and absolutely devoid of fear. She'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, and survived. That left marks that no amount of time could erase. "Lieutenant Mason Hale," she said. "It wasn't a question. Your medic needs immediate care. The helicopter I mentioned? It's carrying medical supplies along with weapons. If we can force it down without destroying the medical section, we might be able to stabilize him properly." "That's the plan?" Vaughn said incredulously. "Shoot down a helicopter to steal its medical supplies?" "I'm open to better suggestions," Aria replied flatly. "But this is what we have. The enemy knows you're pinned here, knows you have a wounded operator. They're going to wait you out, let hypothermia and blood loss do their work. That helicopter is your only chance." Mason studied her face, trying to read the truth behind the words. Shooting down a helicopter was insane. Using it for emergency medical supplies was even more insane. But she was right, they were out of good options. Sometimes the only choice was between bad and worse. "Why are you doing this?" Mason asked. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. You could have stayed hidden, let us handle our own problems." Aria's expression flickered, something painful passing through her eyes before she locked it down. 3 years ago, I lost my entire team because I wasn't good enough. Because I made mistakes. 6 people died because of my failures. I told myself I'd never let it happen again, which is why I walked away from everything. But tonight..." She paused, looking at Park's pale face. "Tonight I have a chance to get it right. I'm not wasting that chance." The words hung in the cold air, heavy with meaning. Mason understood immediately. Survivor's guilt was a burden every combat veteran carried to some degree. For someone like Locke, with her skills and responsibilities, that burden would be crushing. "You saved my team," Mason said quietly. "Whatever happened 3 years ago, whatever mistakes you think you made, you've already gotten it right." Aria shook her head. "Not until everyone makes it home. That's the deal. That's the promise. Everyone home, or the mission isn't finished." The sound of rotor blades began to echo through the valley, still distant but growing closer. The helicopter was approaching ahead of schedule. Aria immediately moved to a better vantage point, her rifle coming off her shoulder with practiced ease. Mason watched her work, fascinated by the clinical efficiency of her movements. This wasn't someone who simply shot targets, this was an artist operating at the peak of human capability. "I need you to create a distraction," Aria said, not taking her eyes off the sky. "Get them to focus on your position, keep the helicopter's attention on you. I'll handle the rest." "What's the rest?" Mason asked. "Something incredibly stupid that will probably get me killed," Aria replied matter-of-factly. "But if it works, we all go home. If it doesn't work, well, at least I'll go down trying to save people instead of hiding from them." The helicopter appeared through the snow, a dark shape backlit by its own searchlight. It was a military transport variant, armed but not as heavily as a dedicated gunship. That was good. It meant the pilot would be more cautious, less likely to make aggressive attack runs. But it also meant they had room for cargo, which supported Aria's theory about medical supplies. Mason gave the order, and his team opened fire on the helicopter. Not aim shots, they weren't trying to hit it just enough to get its attention. Force it to focus on the ground threat. The helicopter banked hard, its searchlight sweeping across the SEAL team's position. The door gunner returned fire, tracers cutting through the darkness. Through his scope, Mason watched Aria line up her shot. She was completely still, a statue carved from ice and determination. The helicopter was moving, bobbing in the turbulent air, presenting a target that changed every microsecond. Hitting the tail rotor would require timing, prediction, and a level of skill that seemed impossible. But apparently, impossible was what Aria Kane did. Aria's world narrowed to the sight picture in her scope. Everything else fell away: the cold, the wind, the sounds of battle, the weight of 3 years' guilt. There was only the target, the weapon, and the shot that would determine whether everyone lived or died. The helicopter was approximately 600 meters away, moving at roughly 70 knots, banking to present its armored side to the SEAL team's ground fire. The tail rotor was exposed for brief moments as the aircraft maneuvered, creating windows of opportunity that lasted less than a second each. She tracked the movement, her mind automatically calculating lead time, bullet drop, wind deflection. The rifle was an extension of her will, her consciousness flowing through the weapon and reaching out toward the target. This was the state her old commander had called the zone, when conscious thought dissolved and pure instinct took over. The helicopter steadied for a moment, lining up for a gun run. The tail rotor was visible, the target window open. Aria's finger applied pressure to the trigger, smooth and progressive. Exactly 4 pounds of pressure distributed perfectly to avoid disturbing the sight picture. The rifle fired. Through the scope, she watched the bullet track through the storm, a tiny piece of copper and lead, carrying the hopes of 8 people who wanted desperately to survive. Time seemed to slow, each microsecond stretching into eternity as the projectile covered the distance to target. The bullet struck the tail rotor's gearbox housing, penetrating through a ventilation slot that existed purely for cooling purposes. It wasn't a lethal hit by itself. The gearbox was designed to handle minor damage, but the bullet had been carefully selected for this specific purpose. A tungsten core, armor-piercing round that fragmented on impact, sending shrapnel through the delicate mechanism inside. The tail rotor's pitch control seized, locked in a position that created maximum lateral thrust. The helicopter immediately began to spin, rotating faster and faster as the pilot fought to maintain control. Aria watched without emotion, tracking the aircraft's descent. The pilot was skilled, using auto-rotation to slow their fall, aiming for a clear area away from the SEAL team's position. The helicopter hit hard, skids buckling, the fuselage crumpling but holding together. It was a controlled crash. The pilot had managed to keep it from becoming a fireball. The crew would be injured but alive. And the medical supplies she'd gambled on? They were right there, waiting to be recovered. "Go," Aria transmitted. "Get those supplies before the enemy regroups." Mason's team was already moving, bounding toward the downed helicopter, with Brennan providing covering fire. Aria scoped the area, looking for threats. The enemy force was repositioning, trying to reach the helicopter first. They understood its value, knew that whoever controlled it controlled the tactical situation. Aria began eliminating targets with methodical precision. She was down to her last 8 rounds, but 8 shots meant 8 problems solved if she didn't miss. The first hostile went down trying to flank the SEAL team's advance. The second dropped while setting up a machine gun position. The third, fourth, and fifth fell in rapid succession as they attempted a coordinated assault. 3 rounds left. Through her scope, she saw Mason's team reach the helicopter. They were moving fast, pulling supplies from the cargo bay, grabbing what they needed for Park's immediate care. The enemy was closing in, but not fast enough. Not with Aria eliminating anyone who got too close. Then she saw the problem. A group of 5 hostiles had worked their way around her field of fire, approaching from an angle she couldn't cover. They were seconds away from a clear shot at the SEAL team, who were completely focused on medical care and wouldn't see the threat until too late. 3 rounds. 5 targets, mathematically impossible. Aria didn't hesitate. She selected her targets with brutal efficiency. The 3 soldiers carrying automatic weapons. The immediate threats: 3 shots, 3 kills, faster than she'd ever fired in her life. The remaining 2 hostiles scattered, their confidence broken. Empty rifle, no ammunition, no way to defend herself if anyone located her position. She'd gambled everything on saving these 8 strangers, and now she was completely vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years of hiding from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of failing anyone ever again. And here she was, having just put herself at the mercy of fate to save people she'd never met. "Locke," Mason's voice came through her radio. "We've got the supplies, stabilizing Park now. What's your status?" Aria looked at her empty rifle, at the enemy forces regrouping in the distance, at the storm that showed no signs of letting up. What was her status? Exposed, out of ammunition, exhausted from 3 hours of precision shooting in impossible conditions. She should run, disappear back into the mountains like she'd done 3 years ago. But she was tired of running. "I'm coming to you," she transmitted. "Cover my approach." She slung the useless rifle across her back and began moving toward the SEAL team's position. Every step felt like a choice, like a conscious decision to stop being a ghost and start being human again. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Halfway to the helicopter, she felt the impact, something punching into her lower back, spinning her around. She'd been shot. The thought was clinical, detached. She'd treated enough gunshot wounds to know this one was serious. Not immediately fatal, but serious enough that she needed care soon. Aria kept moving, one foot in front of the other, refusing to fall. The SEAL team materialized around her, forming a protective cordon, returning fire at targets she couldn't see anymore. Strong hands grabbed her arms, keeping her upright. Mason's face appeared in front of her, saying words she couldn't quite hear over the ringing in her ears. Then they were moving, all of them together, heading towards some destination she didn't know. The pain started to register then, a hot burning sensation that spread through her torso. She'd been lucky the bullet had missed her spine, missed major organs. Unlucky, it had shattered a rib and lodged somewhere near her kidney. The world started to gray out at the edges. She tried to fight it, tried to stay conscious, but her body had other plans. The last thing she remembered was someone saying, "We've got you, Locke. We've got you." Then darkness. Mason sat in the medical tent, watching Aria Locke breathe. She'd been in surgery for 6 hours, the doctors working to repair damage from the gunshot wound and complications from severe hypothermia. For a while, it hadn't looked good, but she was a fighter, even unconscious. The doctors said her sheer stubbornness had probably kept her alive through the initial blood loss. Park was in the next bed, hooked up to IVs, his legs stabilized. He'd make a full recovery, thanks to the supplies Aria had obtained at nearly the cost of her own life. The rest of the team was being checked over, treated for minor injuries and exposure, but they'd all survive. Because of one woman who decided that maybe some things were worth coming out of hiding for. The evacuation had been brutal, a forced march through the storm to a secure landing zone, carrying 2 casualties and fighting off sporadic enemy contact. But they'd made it, all 8 of them plus Aria, everyone home. The promise kept. Aria's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Mason with obvious effort. "The team?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Everyone made it," Mason said. "Your shooting saved 6 lives tonight, 7, if you count yourself." "Don't count me," Aria replied. "I was just settling debts." "That's not how I see it." Mason leaned forward, his expression serious. "You could have let us die. You'd earned the right to be left alone, to live whatever life you'd built in those mountains. But you intervened anyway, risked everything to save strangers. That's not settling debts, that's being a hero." Aria closed her eyes, and Mason thought she might be done talking. Then she spoke again, so quietly, he almost missed it. 3 years ago, my team died because I made a mistake. I've lived with that every day. Tonight I got a chance to do it right. To bring everyone home. That's all I wanted. You succeeded, Mason said firmly. Everyone's home. Mission accomplished. Not everyone, Aria whispered. My team from 3 years ago. They're still gone. This doesn't change that. No, Mason agreed. But maybe it's a start. Maybe it's the first step toward forgiving yourself. They sat in silence for a while, snow falling outside the tent. Somewhere in the distance, someone had set up a small speaker playing Christmas music, a surreal touch of normalcy in a war zone. Aria's breathing gradually steadied, falling into the rhythm of someone drifting toward sleep. "Lieutenant?" she said, her eyes still closed. "Yeah? Thank you for not leaving me behind." Mason smiled. "SEALs don't leave people behind, especially not someone who just saved our lives 8 different times. You're part of the team now, whether you like it or not." Aria's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Merry Christmas, Lieutenant." "Merry Christmas, Locke." She fell asleep then, her breathing deep and even. Mason stayed for a few more minutes, watching the woman who'd emerged from self-imposed exile to save his team. Eventually, he stood, preparing to check on his other operators. As he left the tent, Mason paused, looking up at the snow-filled sky. Christmas morning in a war zone, alive when they should have been dead. He thought about his daughter, about the promise he'd made to come home to her. Thanks to Aria, he'd be keeping that promise. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to clear. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the clouds, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful, in a harsh, unforgiving way. The kind of beauty that reminded you how lucky you were to be alive to see it. Mason heard footsteps behind him. Vaughn appeared, his head bandaged but his eyes alert. "How's she doing?" "She'll make it," Mason replied. "Doctors say she should make a full recovery." "Good." Vaughn was quiet for a moment, then added, "What she did tonight, I've never seen anything like it. She's something special." "Yeah," Mason agreed. "She is." In the distance, a church bell was ringing, the sound carrying across the valley from some village they couldn't see. The clear, pure notes seemed incongruous with the violence of the previous night, but somehow appropriate. Christmas morning, the day of miracles and second chances. Aria had gotten her second chance. She'd proven to herself that she could still save lives, still make a difference, still be something more than a ghost haunted by past failures. Whatever came next for her, she'd taken the first step back toward being whole. And for SEAL Team 9, they'd gotten the greatest Christmas gift possible. They were going home. All of them. Together. As the sun continued to rise, painting the world in shades of hope and possibility, Mason allowed himself a moment of peace. They'd survived the impossible, saved by someone who'd appeared when they needed her most. It was the kind of story that would be told for years, becoming legend in its own right. But for now, in this moment, it was simply true. One woman with a rifle and a need for redemption had stood against impossible odds and won. She'd given them the gift of life, and in doing so, had perhaps given herself the gift of forgiveness. The snow continued to fall gently, covering the scars of battle, making everything clean and new again. Christmas morning had arrived, bringing with it the promise that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, so could you.